Now, we're going to narrow things down a little bit on the topic of generative AI and the move to begin open sourcing many of these big models. I'm excited to introduce Alison Smith, Director of Generative AI at consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton. Alison oversees her company's investments in generative AI with a focus on real business needs. She's here to talk about why open source, which is essentially getting these models into as many hands as possible, is crucial for the future of this technology. Please welcome Alison to the stage. Stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me this morning. I realize I'm standing in between you and your first break, so I'll try to make this as engaging and concise as possible. Today, I'll be talking about open source approaches and what that might look like for generative AI. So first, we have this timeline, and the reason I wanted to do this kind of contextual timeline is because we're so excited about generative AI today that we feel like it's taken everything by storm. And really, it's a culmination of various technological innovation that over time, or usually, were open source. And so some of the building blocks of the generative AI systems you see today largely rely on open source technologies. So starting as early as 1991, we see the release of Linux and Python. And if you're in here today and learning about generative AI, or even in this space, you probably have used both. In 1995, we have the Apache HTTP server, PHP, and MySQL. And you might be wondering, why is Alison talking about web right now? And we have to think for a second about these large language models and what they've been trained on. They've been trained on tons of data that were made possible by how we interact with and use the internet, right? And so any advancements, any open source technology that facilitated that is also one of those precursors. Again, looking in 2004, we have Firefox being released as a web browser. And then the second half of 2000, there's this little thing that we call big data that starts emerging on the scene. And so there's Hadoop, Redis, MongoDB, and Cassandra that all sort of cropped up in this time period. And this is really important. It's really important to understand how that's impacted large language models and generative AI today, mainly because first, we have a ton of data that we need to distribute both the storage and the processing. And two, we're moving away now from databases that were relational databases or even tabular formats that were more traditional, and now dealing with unstructured information. Next, we have in 2015 and 2016, TensorFlow and PyTorch, again, because we're talking about large language models today. I hope all of you are aware that these are probably the two most popular libraries that we use to build machine learning and AI applications. In the bottom right-hand side of this graph from 2010 on, I just listed a bunch of kind of AI innovations that we were tracking. This is not a comprehensive list, but it does give you a sense of this explosion, this feeling that you get every time you open up a news app and read about generative AI. So next, I want to talk a little bit about large language model history. This is an evolutionary tree that is fantastic. I think that illustrates what's going on with the various generative models. At the very bottom, you see the original kind of OGs, which were Word2Vec and Glove back in 2013 and 2014. These were, at the time, considered really large. They captured semantic and syntactic information in these vectors, right? And everyone was sort of, their minds were blown by how effective they were. If you look across the pink branch, you see the BERT and Ernie models, so that family of models. Again, most of them are open source, right? And as we look at that green branch, those are the T5 family of models. And then lastly, the blue branch, which is what we're talking about today mostly. And this is what I'll call the GPT family of models, the ones that are with all the generative AI applications that you're using today. And you'll notice something interesting. As you traverse up that branch, kind of get closer to current day, you're starting to see the models get much more closed, right? So the solid filled in boxes means that they're open, and when they're just outlined, they're closed. And it might kind of make you wonder, like, what's going on here? What is this trend in becoming increasingly closed? And I want to take it back to discussing open source generally. What are the roots of open source, really? And the roots are in software, and what are its benefits, right? Open source's definition extends way beyond just making the source code available. It allows for free distribution. It also allows for derivative works. There's no discrimination against persons, groups, or fields of endeavor. And I want to kind of foot stomp that one because there's some public use agreements now with the various large language models that restrict how you use it. Sometimes you can only use it for research, others for certain fields, for example. But in traditional open source, that did not exist. And then finally, you get a license without restriction. So what did all of those kind of conditions really give us, right? And if you look at that trajectory based on that timeline, the first thing is it definitely increased innovation. The second is that it leveled the playing field, so it wasn't just organizations creating software, but also individual developers. And then again, that democratized software development because so many more people were involved in developing it and making it what society as a whole wanted it to be. And then with that increased number of developers, we also saw a decrease in vulnerabilities. That decrease is kind of interesting, and we'll touch on that later. But basically, as they're extending software, they're creating new cases on that underlying software code. They're finding bugs. They're able to contribute that back. And so what does that actually mean for AI and generative AI? What does open actually look like? And is it truly open source? Because you see a lot of these debates saying, oh, I'm very pro open source generative models, or I'm, think that they should be closed because they're too risky. But really, what we're seeing today is now a spectrum. It's not what we traditionally understand as open source in software. It's a little bit different. And so this spectrum here, you see that fully open is as open as you're going to see the models, all the way to fully closed. And there's some key considerations that have trade-offs, right? So when a model is very open, it tends to have a larger community of research. You're going to reach broader perspectives and have more people contributing. But you're going to also have a lot less control and potentially higher risk. We're not sure about that. For the fully closed model, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the opposite, right? So it's usually a single organization with probably more limited perspectives, but they have a lot more control over the use of the model. And then you have variations in between where you have downloadable models, cloud-based API access ones. That's the ChatGPTs of the world. I personally use it every day, so I'm happy that it's open enough for me to use it. And I can build applications on top of it. But I can't reproduce the model. I don't have the training data. I don't have information on the actual architecture. There's no way for me to recreate it. And so it's not truly open source in the traditional sense. Of course, we have hosted access and gradual stage release as well. And so moving on to my last slide, I just want to kind of pose the question here. If we're all talking about open source as it relates to software, and then we're trying to talk about open source models, pragmatically, can we actually do it, right? And I'm not really sure. I think there are probably a number of reasons why generative AI, or AI generally, is different, right? It's fundamentally different, which makes it difficult to do open source in the traditional way. I've listed 4 here, but I'm sure there are plenty more reasons. The first is the compute requirements. It is super expensive to train, fine-tune, and run inference on these models. A single developer with a computer couldn't do or match the performance of ChatGPT, for example. Second, the data required is huge. It's like large volumes, almost 10% of the internet. And so again, even a group of developers couldn't necessarily do that without a lot of infrastructure and support, right? Next, we have talent. So these teams that create these large language models are multidisciplinary. They are a lot of experts sitting in a room. You have data labelers, you have people who can do reinforcement learning for human feedback. You also have, ethicists on the team that are talking through safety guardrails, for example. And then, of course, you have all variations of engineers. And then lastly, and this is kind of a more nuanced point, but the interpretability of these models, I think, is a limitation in making it truly open source. It's not like what I was saying earlier, how developers of open source software can easily find those vulnerabilities, because the nature of these models being probabilistic, they you can't predict necessarily exactly what outcome you're going to get. You're not necessarily going to interpret the output or be able to say that this is a bug. And so the reason I wanted to lay out the slides this way before having a conversation with Will is to kind of reframe the discussion away from, are you pro open source or against open source, and really think more about, what benefits did open source software give us, right, over time? And given those benefits, can we somehow realize similar benefits in AI and generative AI? And if so, where on that spectrum of openness do we need to be? Or does it depend on the use case or other factors, right? We need to really think through a novel approach to be able to realize some of those benefits while understanding the limitations of AI, in that you can't really truly make it open source the way that we traditionally have. So with that, I'd like to ask Will to join me back up on stage.
Please take a seat. I want to start by stepping back a bit. And why are we even here talking about open source? I've been following AI closely for, I don't know, a decade or more now, and it never used to be at least part of the mainstream conversation. And now suddenly it seems to be, we see news articles about it. It's sort of part of the popular discourse around this. Why is open source such a big deal today?
I think it's because of the power of these models. I think people are reluctant to release something that they don't fully understand and that they recognize is very powerful, without having all the guardrails. And it becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. But historically, open source could be used for any matter of uses, including, bad actors could take open source software and build something, right? And so I think there's a little bit more reluctance, which is why you're seeing this conversation come into play.
Let's talk a little bit about the bad actors and the ethical issues. And I love the way that you framed it. That it's not like all good or all bad. That's a false dichotomy. But I guess it's a way of characterizing the pros and cons lists. And I think some organizations maybe even literally have a pros and cons list. And talking to Meta, for example, which is unusual in big tech for putting out so many open models. But I know this is a real kind of heated debate within the company, like to what extent they can push that. And I know that they have Mark's blessing to continue doing it. But at some point, if something, if the risks outweighed the rewards, then maybe they might close down. So how can we characterize that middle ground between good and bad a bit better? I mean, what kinds of mitigations are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you're already seeing a lot of conversation around responsible AI and thinking through safety and guardrails. And even with some of the commercially available products today, there are guardrails that do prevent you from doing things that are very explicitly dangerous, right? And I think that's the first step. And seeing how policymakers are definitely interested in this and how to shape responsible AI. I think that is probably the first step to a middle ground. Rather than having any closed models, it's to create some guardrails. I also think that it needs to be tested in the wild in order to iterate and come up with better policies and recognize what other dangers are there. I don't think sitting, behind your computer, you'll just be able to figure out all the possible ways that humans are going to be creative in jailbreaking or doing bad things. And so I don't think it's realistic to keep it totally closed.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, but just to remind the audience to please send your questions in. And the sooner you send them in, the more likely we'll have time to get to them. On that point of nobody, we know that all the responsible developers out there are, doing some serious red teaming, which is, trying to in-house break these models, find out the bad things they can do before releasing them. But as you say, no group of people is going to outperform the internet of people in finding sort of the edge cases and the possible things you can do. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Like, do we need to put these models out there into the world knowing that they have potential harms in order to discover those harms?
To some degree, yes. But I think in addition to the guardrails, there are ways to think about these models. Yes, they are built in a way that can be general purpose, but you can deploy them in very use case specific environments to hopefully narrow that scope of usage where you can test out some of the vulnerabilities as well as the risks within that narrow use case. And I think a lot of people aren't thinking about that today just because interacting with, the very ChatGPT and Bard, it's so universal feeling, it's ubiquitous almost. But I think in real life with enterprise use cases, you'll see that narrowing that helps kind of bound the risk a little bit.
And it's worth, we often talk about the harms without being clear about what they are. I mean, I know that people are concerned about misinformation and propaganda campaigns, putting these powerful generative tools in people's hands. There are hateful things you can do with them, misogynistic image generation you can do with them. These things that you and your colleagues do you try and come up with what the things might be, or what other examples of harms concern you?
Yeah, so there are some that are very obvious, like you were saying, where it's producing output that's clearly inappropriate and violent in nature. But then there are sort of latent risks around bias, right? Where it might be generating output that was based off of biased data, and it could be harming certain marginalized groups or individuals. And I think that's a lot harder to explore without kind of thinking through those problems first, right? It's also harder to see because it's latent. It's kind of in that data. And going back to the discussion about open source and why it's so difficult with AI, you're not going to know unless you have the underlying data that the large language model was trained on. And even then, because it's probabilistic in nature, you're still not going to know for sure. And so there are probably some mechanisms that we need to start thinking through collectively as a society about what data we're using to train these models as well.
And we've seen the last year or two, it seems a boom in open source development in these large generative models. You mentioned stability with Stable Diffusion, and then also Luther AI and Meta, who I mentioned. But I'm curious, how sustainable that is, whether that sort of ecosystem can keep up with new resources and the momentum of the big companies. I mean, will there always be a sense where the open source ecosystem, which is often sort of involves volunteers? I mean, can they keep up?
Again, I think it's hard to sort of compare them as apples to apples because they are not, right? A lot of these open source groups or communities do rely on the infrastructure, data sets, and hardware of the larger tech companies. But you do see really striking innovation coming from the open source community. The first thing that comes to mind is actually OpenAI released the GPTs product, which essentially allows you to create GPTs with no code, essentially. And there was a response in the open source community where they created OpenGPT that's built on top of LangChain and allows you to select, 60 plus different large language models. And that happened 3 days, I think, 3 days after OpenAI released their GPTs. And so that kind of competition is what I think is really great for innovation and exploration. And again, it's not so much that they're competing for customers or the use of large language models, because let's be honest, most of the community from the open source world, they're not building their own foundation models, not usually anyway.
Yeah, I think, would we expect the foundation models we have, is that the bedrock on which we're going to build, rather than expecting the open source community to come up with another big GPT-4 rival or something like that?
Yes, and I think that there are pros and cons to that, right? I do feel that most enterprises even, and groups of developers and nonprofit groups, they're not typically going to train their own foundation model from scratch. That is a very expensive endeavor. And then earlier we were talking about climate and the impacts of these models on climate. And so I don't think ethically everyone should be developing their own foundation model. And so recognizing that we're going to rely to some degree on the foundation models that already exist or that are being created by these large technology firms with resources, as a society, I think there's probably some policies that we need to discuss around the foundation models and how best to create guardrails and governance around them.
Is this also a question from Jacques about monopolies? Is this also about preventing a few companies having a monopoly on this technology? And we're going to hear from OpenAI this afternoon, but they have plans to launch basically kind of an app store for sort of GPT agents. So you give them the ability to developers to sort of make your own custom little GPT bot, and then the best ones get uploaded. And so there you have already, all the sort of little bots maybe you can imagine. It's just there on OpenAI's website with OpenAI's technology, which maybe removes the incentive to push open source so much if you have what you need from a company.
I mean, that is definitely, well, I wouldn't call it a monopoly if a company is winning because they have a superior product necessarily. But that said, that's exactly what I was talking about with the open source community responding to that app store a few days later with their own open version of it that they called OpenGPT that allows you to determine which model you want to use for those same little agents, right? I do think that there is some, network effects going on here, where the more that people use a certain technology product, the more other people will use it. And I think you're going to see that with the early adopters like OpenAI and some of the larger tech firms. I'm not sure if the open source community would be combating that specifically.
I want to move on to regulation. We've had a few questions from the audience on regulation-related questions. There's so much to say there. I suppose to lump a lot of things together, then in terms of harms and then legal issues around copyright, we might expect some self-regulation from industry just for sort of PR purposes. You want to sort of do the right thing because that'll give you a more marketable product. But maybe open source is not sort of driven quite by the same motivations. And so is there a greater need for regulation there? And if there is, does it get regulated at the development stage, deployment, or sort of on a use case basis? What are your thoughts?
That is a very interesting question. So just to make sure I understand, you're asking whether there needs to be more regulation on the open source community, given how open it is to any use or any person. And I think philosophically, that's an interesting question. But in practice, I would almost ask, who are the biggest advocates of creating extra regulation on open source, right? And on top of that, there are externalities of, does that create an undue burden on the open source communities, which are much less funded than these large tech companies? And it's not to say that there should be no regulation, but I think targeting only open source is probably not the correct way to go. In fact, I think there's a principle in cybersecurity that's like security through obscurity doesn't actually work, right? And I think the same thing could be said for some of these proprietary closed models. If we were to think about regulation for society, I think we should really think about it for all models.
What would happen if sort of the boom that we've seen in open source sort of died away for whatever reasons? I introduced this section by saying that sort of open source is sort of crucial for the healthy future of this technology, which is sort of a vibe I've had from talking to you in the past and from others. Not to make it sort of too existential about the well-being of the technology, but maybe give us a sense of what's at stake.
What's at stake if
sort of the open source ecosystem can't sustain the boom we've seen in pushing innovation and putting it in as many people's hands as possible.
Oh, I've never thought of that. It's hard to actually fathom a world in which open source community doesn't stay so engaged and involved. I'm not sure how many in the crowd here has worked on these open source projects, but the passion that it takes to do something that's frequently not your full-time job is just too present in this innovator's spirit that I just don't see.
But even if the passion is there, then you talked about the resources that are needed, but not just people's time, but the enormous compute, the enormous data sets, which are really hard to get hold of. It might just be something that companies have more resources in which to develop these things.
I do think that many of these companies, though, benefit from open source as well. Earlier in that timeline, I was showing that TensorFlow and PyTorch, which are by Google and now Meta, they open source these libraries because it basically sets a standard for future development that they can then bring back into their own ecosystem and then inspire other products. And so even if we're trying to think of a world where, let's say a company says, I'm going to cut off all your resources, you can't use my infrastructure or data, I don't think that actually serves an economic purpose for these companies. And so I would be pretty surprised if I saw that happen.
We've got just a few seconds left, but I just want to end on something else I was curious to ask you about. That I've seen it said, so some of you may remember when Google put out Bard, they had this big thing about, it's an experiment, which is a great disclaimer to have, but also they got a lot of pushback from people saying, the goal of these companies to experiment on the public. They put out this tool with all these sort of warts and everything, and we're the guinea pigs to try and find out what the harms are. I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I think we had a discussion about this earlier, but basically, I think running an experiment on people when they opt in to use the technology is a way of letting them know that they are part of it. But anyone who uses technology probably understands that we are subjects to A/B testing all the time, and whether that's ethical, you could argue, but it's a very common practice. It's not new to generative AI, and I don't think it's new to using Bard. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.